Attempted restoration of the Temple at Jerusalem, AD 363. These in broad outline were the events of that year. But Julian, who had already been consul 3 times, now entered on his 4th tenure of the highest magistracy, taking as his colleague Sallustius, the prefect of Gaul. The association of a private citizen with the emperor was a novelty. The last recorded instance was that of Aristobulus with Diocletian. In spite of his extreme eagerness to push on the multifarious preparations for his campaign, and his anxiety to be forearmed against all contingencies, Julian nonetheless extended his activity into every field. His desire to leave a great monument to perpetuate the memory of his reign led him to think in particular of restoring at enormous expense the once magnificent temple at Jerusalem, which, after much bitter fighting during its siege first by Vespasian and then by Titus, had finally been stormed with great difficulty. Alypius of Antioch, who had once governed Britain as the Praetorian prefect's deputy, was placed in charge of the project. He set to work boldly, assisted by the governor of the province, but repeated and alarming outbursts of fireballs near the foundation made it impossible to approach the spot. Some of the workmen were burned to death, and the obstinate resistance of the fiery element caused the design to be abandoned. At the same period, the emperor conferred various honours on envoys sent to him from the Eternal City, men of distinguished family and approved worth. Apronian was appointed prefect of Rome and Octavian proconsul of Africa. The governorship of Spain was entrusted to Venustus, and Rufinus Arradius was promoted to be Count of the East in place of the emperor's uncle Julian, who had recently died. After making these arrangements, Julian was alarmed by an omen which subsequent events proved to be all too accurate. Felix, Count of the largesse, had died suddenly by a hemorrhage and had been followed to the grave by Count Julian. The populace, taking their cue from the emperor's official titles, uttered them in the order Felix Julian Augustus. There had also been another unlucky incident. On the very first day of January, when the emperor was ascending the steps of the temple of the genius of the Roman people, one of the priests in attendance, who was older than the rest, suddenly fell, though no one pushed him, and died a totally unexpected death. The bystanders, either from ignorance or from a desire to flatter Julian, insisted that the omen applied to the older of the 2 consuls, that is, to Sallustius, but events showed that it pointed to the approaching death not of the senior in age, but to the senior in rank. Beside these, other less important signs indicated on various occasions what was to ensue. At the very start of the preparations for the Parthian War, it was reported that Constantinople had been shaken by an earthquake, and the experts announced that this was not a happy omen for a ruler who was intent on invading the territory of another. So they tried to persuade Julian to abandon this ill-timed enterprise and to convince him that signs of this sort could be neglected with propriety only in the face of a foreign invasion, when to defend the safety of the state by every possible means with unremitting energy is the one fixed law which supersedes all others. At the same time, Julian was told by letter that a consultation of the Sibylline books that he had ordered had elicited the definite answer that the emperor must not advance beyond the frontiers that year. Crossing of the Euphrates. Meanwhile, envoys from many races presented themselves giving promises of help. They were warmly received, but their offers were declined, the emperor declaring with a fine show of confidence that it was beneath the dignity of Rome to rely on foreign aid for its defence. On the contrary, it was Rome that should support its friends and allies if they had any need to beg of its assistance. An exception was made in the case of Arsaces, king of Armenia, who was warned to collect a strong force and wait for orders, and told that he would learn shortly where to march and what steps to take. Then, seizing the first opportunity consistent with prudence, Julian hastened to occupy enemy territory before any rumour of his coming could precede him. Spring had hardly arrived when he sent marching orders to the units of his army and ordered them all to cross the Euphrates. All hurried from their winter quarters, crossed the river in accordance with their instructions, and awaited the arrival of the emperor in various cantonments. He himself, on the eve of leaving Antioch, appointed one Alexander of Hierapolis to the government of Syria. Alexander was a violent and cruel man, and Julian remarked that he did not merit the post, but that such a magistrate was what the greedy and rebellious people of Antioch deserved. At his departure he was escorted by a heterogeneous crowd praying for a successful outward march and a glorious return, and begging that he would then show himself milder and less intransigent. But his anger at their abuse and insults had not abated, and he replied in bitter terms, declaring that he had no intention of visiting them again. He told them that he had made his plans for the winter. At the end of the campaign he would return to Tarsus in Cilicia by the shortest route, and he had already written to Mamurius, the governor of Tarsus, to make all necessary preparations for his reception. This, in fact, was what happened not long afterwards. His body was brought back to Tarsus with the minimum of parade or fuss and buried in accordance with his own instructions in a suburb of the city. On the 5th of March he set out under a sunny sky and came to Hierapolis by the usual route. As he entered the gates of that great city, a colonnade on his left suddenly collapsed. Its beams and timbers crushed 50 soldiers who were camping under it, as well as wounding a large number of others. Then, concentrating all his forces, he made a rapid march towards Mesopotamia. His object was to seize Assyria by surprise, and he had taken the strictest precautions against any rumour of his movements preceding him. Finally he crossed the Euphrates on a bridge of boats and arrived with his army and his Scythian auxiliaries at Batni, a town in Osdrone. Here he encountered a sinister omen. A great throng of grooms assembled by an immensely high hayrack of the type constructed in those parts. They came to get fodder as usual, but so many seized on it at once that the hayrack tottered and collapsed, and in its fall the huge mass buried 50 men, who were all killed. March through Mesopotamia. Julian left Batni in a state of gloom, and advanced by forced marches to Carrhae, an ancient town memorable as the site of the disaster of the Roman army under Crassus and his son. At Carrhae the two royal roads to Persia fork. The left goes through Adibayne and over the Tigris, the right through Assyria and along the Euphrates. Julian stayed at Carrhae some days to complete his preparations and sacrificed according to the local rite to the moon, which is worshipped in that region. There is a story that, while he was standing before the altar and no third party was present, he handed his purple cloak in conditions of complete secrecy to his kinsman Procopius, with orders that he should boldly seize the throne if he learned that Julian had fallen in the Parthian War. Julian was disturbed here in his sleep by a dream, which gave him a foreboding of some approaching calamity, so he and the interpreters of dreams reviewed the circumstances and concluded that a careful watch must be kept on the following day, which was the 19th of March. In fact, however, as was afterwards learnt, it was on this same night that the temple of Palatine Apollo in the Eternal City went up in flames during the prefecture of Apronion, and if help of various sorts had not been at hand, the books of the Cumbrian Sibyl also would have been consumed by the raging fire. After dealing with these matters, Julian was organising his column of march and supplies of all kinds when he received a report from scouts who arrived panting for breath that some squadrons of the enemy horse had suddenly violated the frontier nearby and carried off booty. Stung by the outrage, Julian at once put into execution a plan already formed. He put 30,000 picked troops under the joint command of Procopius and Count Sebastian, formerly commander in Egypt, with orders to stay for the time being on the nearer side of the Tigris and keep their eyes open for any unexpected attack on his unguarded flank, of a kind which experience taught him often occurred. They were also to effect a junction, if possible, with King Arsaces, march with him through Cordiune and Moxone, lay waste in passing a rich region of Media called Chilocomium, and other districts, and finally meet Julian while he was still operating in Assyria to reinforce him if he need their help. When this was settled, Julian made a feint of setting out himself by the Tigris route along which he had purposely ordered supply dumps to be placed, but in fact wheeled to the right. After a quiet night, he called next morning for his usual mount, which was called Babylonius. When it was brought in, it rolled on the ground in an attack of colic, and in its agony damaged its harness, which was studded with gold and precious stones. This portent caused Julian to exclaim triumphantly amid the applause of his suite, "Babylon lies low, stripped of all her finery." After a short halt to make a sacrifice which would confirm the favourable omen, he reached the fortified camp of Davana at the source of the river Baelis, a tributary of the Euphrates. Here the troops fed and rested, and the next day reached Callinicum, a strongly walled place and a rich centre of trade. Here on the 27th of March, the day on which a procession in honour of the Mother of the Gods is held annually at Rome, and the carriage which conveys her image is washed, we are told, in the waters of the Almo. He celebrated her festival according to the ancient ritual, and slept peacefully through the night in a glow of joy and confidence. The next day he kept on with his escort along the high bank of the river, whose waters were swollen by affluents from all directions, and reached an outpost where he bivouacked. Here some sheiks of the Saracen tribe offered on their knees a crown of gold and paid him homage as lord of the world and its peoples. He gave them a gracious reception because of their usefulness in guerrilla warfare. While he was addressing them, a fleet as large as that of the mighty Xerxes arrived under the command of the tribune Constantian and Count Lucilian. It covered the whole width of the broad Euphrates and consisted of 1,000 transport vessels of various types carrying abundant supplies of food, weapons, and siege engines, 50 ships of war, and an equal number of pontoons for bridge building. Crossing of the Kaba at Circusium. After incorporating with his army the auxiliaries so willingly offered by the Saracens, the emperor made a rapid march to Circusium, which he entered at the beginning of April. Circusium is a strongly and cunningly constructed fortress. Its walls are washed by the rivers Kaba and Euphrates, which form what is practically an island. In earlier times it was a small and insecure place, but Diocletian, when he was organising defences in depth of our actual frontier with the barbarians, surrounded it with walls and high towers to prevent the Persians making an inroad into Syria of the kind that had occurred some years before, and inflicted great damage on our provinces. What happened on that occasion was this. One day at Antioch, while a comedian and his wife were on the stage performing some scenes from common life before a hushed and admiring audience, the woman said, "Unless I am dreaming, the Persians are here." The spectators all turned their heads and then fled in confusion to escape the missiles raining down upon them. The city was set on fire, and many people who were strolling at large, as one does at time of peace, were cut down. The neighbourhood was burned and ravaged, and the enemy returned home without loss and laden with spoils. Marades, who had rashly guided them to destroy his fellow citizens, was burned alive. This incident took place in the reign of Gallienus, while Julian was watching at Circusium for the construction of a bridge of boats to enable his army and its hangers-on to cross the Carba. He received a gloomy letter from Sallustius, the prefect of Gaul, begging him to defer the campaign against the Parthians and conjuring him not to expose himself to inevitable destruction since he had failed so far to obtain the approval of heaven. Julian ignored this prudent advice and pushed on confidently, for no human strength or merit has ever availed to prevent what has been ordained by the decree of destiny. As soon as he had crossed, he ordered the bridge to be destroyed so that no one should lag behind his unit in the belief that he could go back. Here too he encountered an unfavourable omen in the shape of the outstretched corpse of a commissary who had fallen by the hand of the executioner. Sallustius, the praetorian prefect in attendance, had condemned him to death because, after promising to furnish additional provisions before a certain day, he had been prevented by circumstances from fulfilling his undertaking. But on the day following the wretched man's execution, another fleet arrived, as he had promised, with plentiful supplies. Setting out from here, we reached a place called Zytha, which means olive tree. Here we saw, while we were still at a distance, the tomb of the Emperor Gordian, whose history from his earliest boyhood, successful campaigns, and treacherous murder I have described in their proper place. Julian, with his innate piety, sacrificed to the deified emperor, and was on his way to the deserted town of Dura when he saw a troop of soldiers in the distance and came to a halt, wondering what they were bringing him. It turned out to be a huge lion, which had attacked their unit and been dispatched by a rain of weapons. Julian was overjoyed by what he regarded as a certain omen of success and pursued his course. But there is no trusting the fickle winds of fortune, and the event was far otherwise. The death of a king was foreshadowed, but it was not clear of which king, in fact. History tells us of other ambiguous oracles whose meaning became clear only from subsequent events. There is, for example, the prediction from Delphi that if Croesus crossed the Halys, he would destroy a great empire, and another which darkly indicated that the Athenians should choose the sea as the theatre of war against the Medes. A third, later than these, was true but nevertheless ambiguous. You, son of Aeacus, I say, the Roman people can vanquish. The Etruscan soothsayers, however, who accompanied the other experts on prodigies, finding that their frequent attempts to stop the campaign met with no success, brought out their manuals of divination in time of war and demonstrated that this sign constituted a prohibition against the invasion of another's territory by a ruler, even if right were on his side. This warning was met with contemptuous dismissal from the philosophers, who had much influence at that moment, though they were often wrong and opted to put up dogged fights about matters of which they knew little. On this occasion they advanced as a plausible argument why they should be believed the experience of the former Caesar Maximian. The dead body of a lion and a huge wild boar were brought to him when he was on the point of joining battle with the Persian king Narses, and he came back safe after defeating the enemy, but they left out of the account the fact that such an omen signified the destruction of an aggressor, and that Narses had in fact begun the conflict by seizing Armenia, which was under Roman jurisdiction. A further omen occurred on the following day, on the 7th of April. Towards sunset, a cloud, which was at first quite small, suddenly spread over the darkening sky and obscured the light. An alarming storm followed, with frequent thunder and lightning, in the course of which a soldier called Jovian and 2 horses which he was bringing back from watering in the river were struck dead by a thunderbolt. The interpreters of such things were sent for and questioned. They declared with confidence that this too was an omen against the campaign. The thunderbolt was of the type known as advisory, the name they give to an omen which either prohibits or prescribes a particular course. In this case, caution was especially needed because the soldier killed with the chargers bore so exalted a name, and the books on the subject say that one should not look or tread on spots struck by lightning. The philosophers, on the other hand, maintained that there was no particular significance in this sudden flash of fire from the heaven. It was merely a violent blast of wind pushed down from the upper air by some force. If it portended anything, it was an increase of honour for the emperor at the outset of his glorious enterprise, since it is common knowledge that fire naturally flies upwards if there is nothing to check it. So when all had crossed and the bridge, as I said, had been broken down, the emperor thought it his first duty to address his troops, who were inspired in their bold advances by belief in themselves and in their commander. In answer to a trumpet call, all the centuries, cohorts, and maniples assembled, and the emperor, standing on a mound of earth and surrounded by a suite of high-ranking officers, delivered with an air of calm confidence the following speech, which was received by all with enthusiastic approval. Seeing you, my gallant men, full of such energy and eagerness, I have decided to address you, and I mean to demonstrate to you by more than one example that this is not, as some scandal-mongers suggest, the first time that Romans have invaded the kingdom of Persia, to say nothing about Lucullus or of Pompey, who, after traversing the lands of the Albani and Massagatæ, whom we now call the Alans, broke into this country also and set eyes on the Caspian Sea. We know that Antony's lieutenant Ventidius gained countless bloody victories in these parts. Passing on, however, from early times, I will run over events of more recent history. Trajan and Verus and Severus came back from this country crowned with the laurels of victory, and the younger Gordian, at whose tomb we have just done reverence, would have returned with equal glory after defeating the Persian king at Rissana and putting him to flight, had he not fallen victim at the spot where he now lies buried to a wicked conspiracy hatched by the Praetorian prefect Philip and a few accomplices in crime. But his spirit did not long wander unavenged. Justice weighed his enemies in her scales, and all who plotted Gordian's destruction met an agonizing death. And whereas these emperors were impelled by ambition to embark on their memorable enterprises, the driving force behind our undertaking is the wretchedness of recently captured cities, the unavenged shades of our slaughtered armies, the immense damage we have suffered, and the loss of our standards. We are all united in our desire to remedy past disasters and to strengthen the Roman state on its flanks, so that posterity may have a glorious account to give of us. With the help of the eternal Godhead, your emperor will be with you everywhere. The front ranks as well as the cavalry shall see him among them, and the omens, I believe, are good. But if fickle fortune should lay me low in battle, I shall be content to have sacrificed my life for the Roman world, like the Curii and Musi and the noble family of the Daci in early times. Our task is to wipe out a most pernicious people, on whose swords the blood of our kin is not yet dry. It took our ancestors many generations to uproot the obstacles in their path. Carthage was defeated in a long and confused war, but its great conqueror was afraid to let it survive his victory. After enduring the manifold accidents of a siege, Scipio razed Numantia to the ground. Rome overthrew Fidenae lest she should become her rival, and in the same way crushed Falerii and Veii, so that even reliable ancient records have a task to convince us that these cities were ever powerful. These examples I have given you from my knowledge of history. It remains for you to check the greed for loot which has often been the bane of Roman troops. Keep in strict formation as you advance, and when the moment comes to fight, stick to your own unit. You may be sure that any man who lags behind will be left hamstrung. I fear nothing but the trickery and guile of our wily foe. Finally, I give you all a solemn promise that once the business is brought to a successful end, I will waive the privilege of emperors to use their authority as sufficient warrant for the rightness of their orders and decisions, and will make myself accountable to anyone who requires it for the correctness of my actions or the reverse. So now I beg you, summon up your courage, summon it up in full expectation of success, knowing that I shall take an equal share in any hardships you may undergo, and remembering that a just cause always triumphs. These words made a most acceptable preparation. The warriors, glorying in the reputation of their chief, and fired by hope of success, raised their shields aloft and cried out that they would find nothing dangerous or difficult under a leader who imposed more toil on himself than on the common soldiers. The Gallic units in particular demonstrated their feelings by shouts of joy. They remembered how often, when Julian was in command and moving among their ranks, they had seen some peoples destroyed and others compelled to sue for mercy. Among all these peoples of various tongues, there are differences of physical type as well as of situation. But if I am to give a general description of their appearance and character, I would say that they are among all slight in build, with a darkish or livid and bloodless complexion. Their eyes are like goat's eyes and have a grim expression. Their eyebrows are arched in a semicircle and meet in the middle. They have handsome beards and wear their hair long. All without distinction carry swords in their girdles, even at banquets and on public feast days. This is a custom which we have the unquestioned authority of Thucydides for, saying that the Athenians were the first of the Greeks of antiquity to lay aside. Most Persians are inordinately addicted to the pleasure of sex, and find even a large number of concubines hardly enough to satisfy them. They do not practice pederasty. A man has many of his wives according to his means, and his affections, being divided between a number of objects, are lukewarm. The luxury of an elegant table, and especially indulgence in drink, they shun like the plague. Only the king has a set hour for dining. Apart from him, every man times his meals by their stomach. When this gives the signal, he eats whatever is available, and once he has satisfied his hunger, no one loads his digestion with superfluous food. Their restraint and caution are so extraordinary that sometimes they march through the vineyards and gardens of an enemy without attempting to touch anything for fear of poison or black arts. They are also most careful to avoid any violation of modesty. You will hardly ever see a Persian make water standing or step aside to answer the call of nature. They are so careless and undisciplined in their movements, and slouch about so sloppily, that you might think them effeminate, but in fact they are most active warriors, craftily rather than courageously, and particularly formidable at a long range. They are full of empty words and talk madly and extravagantly. They are tiresomely and disgustingly boastful, and given to threats whether things are going well or ill. They are cunning, proud, and cruel, and claim the power of life and death over slaves and humble plebeians. They flay men alive, either completely or bit by bit. No servant who waits on them at table is allowed to open his mouth, speak, or spit. Once the cloth is spread, everyone's lips are sealed. They are greatly in awe of their laws. Those dealing with ingrates and traitors are especially grim, and they have other detestable statutes which provide that a whole family should be put to death for the guilt of a single member. They appoint as judges men of experience and integrity who have no need of others to advise them. In consequence, they laugh at our custom of giving unlearned judges eloquent assessors who are thoroughly versed in public law. But the story that a judge was made to take his seat on the skin of another judge who had been convicted of corruption is an ancient fiction, or, if such a custom ever existed, it has gone out of use. Their military training and discipline and their constant practice of manoeuvres and arms drills, which I have often described, make them formidable even to large armies. They rely especially on their cavalry, in which all their nobility and men of mark serve. Their infantry are armed like gladiators and obey orders like soldiers' servants. These people follow behind their masters in a mass, condemned as it were to perpetual servitude and never remunerated either by pay or by presents. This nation, so bold and well exercised in martial arts, would have set its yoke on many peoples beside those which it has fully subdued, had it not been constantly harassed by domestic and foreign wars. Most of them are dressed in garments of various gleaming colours. Much are open in front and at the sides and flutter in the wind, but never expose any part of their bodies from head to heel. After their victory over Lydia and Croesus, they acquired the habit of wearing gold armlets and necklaces, and particularly pearls, which they possess in great abundance.